Giovanni Bausan. That's literally the best I could come up with for that one. Right then, so 19th century cruisers continues. This is Series 2, Part 2, and the Giovanni Bausan, which I put in primarily because I like to give you a little bit of randomness sometimes, and the Giovanni Bausan is about as random a cruiser as I could get. In her career, she participated in the conquest of Eritrea, which is not really a conquest when the country you're dealing with is an ardent monarchy, which is almost descending into civil war because the king has died and there's a dispute over who's going to succeed him, and there's no troops in that region, and you already own sections of it thanks to having got them off the British and having fortified them earlier with various previous agreements, and therefore you're pretty much just taking over bits which you're moving your troops into, and there's nothing really there which can form an organised resistance. However, she was the flagship of the Italian squadron during that. She took part in the Venezuelan crisis of 1902 to 1903 alongside the British and German ships sent, which of course was when the Americans got really interested in what was going on in the world, and well, basically Roosevelt uses it in the Monroe Doctrine as a way to justify increased naval expenditure and sending the White Fleet around the world, but also, how do I put this politely, it also shows the general weakness of the American position in terms of naval power at that point. During the Italo-Turkish War of 1911 to 1912, she of course provided gunfire support to Italian troops fighting in North Africa against, well, let's be honest, the Ottomans. And, well, in the First World War, she was working as a distilling ship and then as a depot ship for seaplanes. Yeah. She's built by Ellswick, so she is definitely an Ellswick cruiser. Pretty ship. Now, she is in theory based on the Esmeralda, which of course I've done a video on, which was laid down in 1881 and launched in 1883. However, she's laid down in 1882 and launched in 1883. See a point here? So, she's based on her, but Esmeralda is not in service when this thing is being built. So, basically she's based on the idea of Esmeralda and what Esmeralda might offer, not on what Esmeralda does offer. This makes her a little bit different. Just a tad. Smidgen different from Esmeralda. Although I will agree that for some of you, if you take a picture of Esmeralda in about the same period and you look at her, you will be going, these ships look incredibly similar. I mean, I know there's a couple of 100 tons difference, but they are very similar. Let me help you out with this one. This is the Esmeralda. This is the Esmeralda. And, well, how do I put it politely? As one goes through the design, they match up more and more. 4.5 main guns, side guns in sponsons. Yep, very similar. So that leads you to sort of thinking, well, are they two ships of the same class? Well, no, there is enough changes to make them a separate class. Now considered a separate class. But they're not that radically different from each other. They really aren't. I would say that Esmeralda is faster. The Giovanni Bausan only came with 17.4 knots compared to her more, positively racy 18.3 knots. And the Bausan was capable of 3,500 nautical miles at 10 knots, whereas the Esmeralda, well, she carried 600 tons of coal, and that would get her wherever 600 tons of coal got her. But the main differences comes in their armament. Both have two 10-inch guns. Both had, well, the Esmeralda had 6 6-inch guns. The Giovanni Bausan has 5.9-inch guns. That's 150mm ones. I'm thinking they might have been European. Yep. Designed by the Ellswick Ordnance Company, produced by Armstrong Whitworth in late 1880s for the Italian Navy. So produced to the European standard. The first ever 152mm in Italian service. But still, they were fun weapon systems. Overall, armour between the Esmeralda and the Giovanni Bausan, well, the Esmeralda has 1-inch deck armour over most places. The Bausan, 0.75-inch to 1.5 inches of deck armour. So basically has the thicker bit hump in the middle over the machine spaces is 1.5 inches, and the bits towards the end are 0.75 inches. So has more armour, and as mentioned earlier, it displaces 3,131 tons to the Esmeralda's 2,997 tons. So there is a difference. 134 tons. That's still a difference. It's still a difference. And the Bausan is longer. And we can get into this more here. So there has definitely been an evolution. There has been a development of the idea from the start of building Esmeralda to the start of constructing Giovanni Bausan. And that's an entirely theoretical period. Note this. The design is evolving before the ship has even hit the water. They're still working on it. They're still trying to make it better. They're still conducting thought experiments and trying to think of how better to adapt the idea. This is something which is often forgotten. When we're discussing ships and the evolution of ships, people often look at me and go, well, why are you talking about this? What does it matter? What's the bearing going on? Well, the bearing often that's going on is that these ships are being designed for a specific reason and a specific set of roles. And the roles might transition a bit, but also technology is always adapting and improving. And the armour you have access to in 1881 is going to be possibly less good than the armour and armaments you have access to in 1882 when you're designing. And you're designing for that. And you are constantly improving the design as you're thinking it through. So that explains why the Bausan is quite so different from the Esmeralda, despite them, realistically, the Bausan being the next of the Ellswick cruisers. You would expect her to be an improvement in every direction, and she's not. No, they're only adding on 131 tons. They are actually dropping the indicated horsepower. She drops down by 333 indicated horsepower. And so she's heavier, less powerful. She can achieve 17.4 knots. She's still a good ship. But she's a very different ship than the Esmeralda. She's got torpedo tubes. She has got 57mm and 37mm guns. And at a certain point you realise, hang on, this is an Imperial cruiser. This is a ship being made for Chile, to allow them to fight their counterparts. This is a ship being made for Italy, to allow it to compare itself with France and with other powers in the Mediterranean, and to also wander around the wider world and go, look how powerful we are. Those 3 14-inch tubes, they make a difference. The fact they have the same 10-inch guns and virtually the same in terms of 6-inch guns, we'll leave that to one side. The 4 57mm versus 5 57mm quick firing 6-pounder guns, and 2 37mm versus 5 37mm guns, quick firing 1-pounder guns. You know, having all these additions. 2 6-pounder, that's 57mm guns, versus 4 57mm guns. 5 37mm versus 2 37mm. All these things are additions you put on if you think you're probably going to be turning up and be the big presence, and you're going to have to be dealing with little ships. But you're thinking also that there's going to be something bigger than you that you're going to have to fight, so actually having your torpedo tubes makes sense, because that's how you counter a larger armoured cruiser and a larger sort of, well, a battleship, theoretically. Theoretically, in reality, the odds are you're gonna be sunk by the battleship. But, you know, the fact is, the presence of the 14-inch torpedo tubes, and the fact you have 3 of them, does mean you have a risk factor. The battleship can't be sure it can take you down. This is another thing you notice with the Spanish-American War. If the ships in the Spanish fleet had had more torpedoes, and they'd been working and actually been fitted for more torpedoes, and they'd had a few vessels like the Esmeralda, like the Giovanni Bausan, the war could have gone very differently, because the Americans would still have been probably bringing the more powerful ships to the table, and wouldn't most likely have won the fights. But they'd have lost a lot more ships doing it, and it might well have been viewed as either a poisoned chalice. After all, you deliver the enemy a victory which is so costly, so bloody, that they lose all ability to fight any other wars. Consequence would have been for, let's say, the Venezuelan events of 1903-1904 could have been even worse, in that a weakened America from 1899 could have ended up reacting by actually doing something dangerous and stupid to try and reassure themselves that they were strong. Or they could have been so shown up by it that they end up going into their internal phase and their introspective phase even earlier. Those are the options that happen. So these ships are interesting. And the fact is, you need a lot more of them if you are a nation. Protected ships, whether they're first or second class protected cruisers, are in many ways, in terms of peer relations, they are a risk fleet strategy. They're a ship you're probably going to win a fight against, but how quickly are you going to win that fight against? And if they're carrying torpedoes and they're carrying powerful enough guns, they only need a lucky shot. We've seen in history plenty of golden BBs. They happen more often than you want to think about, really, because especially on some ships where their crews realise their only chance of survival and still having their ship is if they manage to get that lucky shot, they work on it. They really do work on their accuracy and their ability to fire. And you do see this in some of the ships. Now again, the Spanish fleet in 1899 has many, many years of not having actually done any training. In fact, if you could find a more uninvested in fleet than Spanish fleet in 1899, then you're probably looking at China's fleet in that same period. So they're not a good scenario. But the Italian fleet is getting invested in. It is getting developed. And this cruiser is part of that. The fact is, she's then succeeded by the Etna class. And the Etna class are pretty darn pretty. They're also protected cruisers. And they are built in Italy. But they're in many ways an Italian evolution of the Giovanni Bausan design. They are slightly enlarged and, well, they're copies to an extent. Their flagship, well, not flagship, their namesake of their class, provides the stationary headquarters for the C&C in Taranto for the duration of the war. And 3 of the class had taken part in the Boxer Rebellion as part of the Eight Nation Alliance that went out there. So the Etna class are big, powerful ships, to an extent. They're big and powerful compared to what most people have around the world when they turn up instead of the major powers. But again, they are a further 340 tons heavier than the Bausan is. And they carry 4 14-inch torpedo tubes, and their deck armour is 1.5 inches universal across the entire ship. The armour deck is 1.5 inches the whole way. Now, the Bausan in service history, well, it was fun. It was always going to be a sort of stable ship, as she also had an armour belt of cork at her waterline. So that kind of... how do I put this? It's designed to swell through water absorption after being hit and protect things. But it gives her quite a lot of stability if she does develop leaks, etc. Although, in reality, if she was hit, it resulted in the destruction of the cork. So, and the Bausan also had 2 inches of armour plating around the conning tower, and the breeches of main gun were also protected by 2 inches of armour. Now, for the invasion of Eritrea and participation in the international squadron, she was pretty darn critical for Italian representation. She had been with the Navy for 2 years when she participated in the conquest of Eritrea, which, as I said already, was not really a conquest. Not a conquest by what you would normally say, because they were basically taking advantage of a country which was in absolute turmoil. So yes, it was a conquest because they did conquer it, but the whole sort of fighting part of it could be summed up as they turned up when everyone else's backs were turned, and then just basically presented everyone with fait accompli. Which is traditional in some parts of empire building. And she was the flagship of the Italians' Red Sea Squadron at this point, which is an important thing, having a Red Sea Squadron. It's kind of like the Germans... Germans sort of Asiatic squadron. It's this powerful symbol of our ability to have an empire. We have a squadron in the Red Sea. And the British are sort of looking at it going, yeah? We have a fleet in the Mediterranean. We have a squadron in the Red Sea. We have squadrons in the Far East. We have squadrons in... Why do you keep talking about your squadron in the Red Sea? We have a squadron in the Red Sea. Okay, fine. You do realise the only way to it is to go through the Suez Canal, which we control, or Gibraltar, which we control. We have a squadron in the Red Sea. Okay, you've repeated this several times. It was important, though. She returned to Italy in 1888. And she took part in the fleet manoeuvres, which were considered great statement of their strength, especially versus France, because they managed to mobilise a force of 4 ironclads, 3 other protected cruisers, so 4 in total, and 4 torpedo cruisers, plus small vessels. So they consider themselves a very strong fleet. They took part in close order drills and decided to both attack and defend La Spezia. Then she took part in a naval review for Kaiser Wilhelm when he visited Italy, to show him how powerful the Italian navy was. In 1899, she collided with a torpedo cruiser, Folgore, damaging her badly. And let's be honest, torpedo cruisers are the ultimate admitting that you really aren't the most powerful nation in the world. The British built them and basically considered them defensive ships they could put around the empire that would be constantly going, if you're a bigger ship, yes, you'll win the fight, but you might get a torpedo in you, which means you'll lose anyway. And having them as your major part of your constituent force, i.e. a third of your major capital units, is kind of a case of, oh, we're sorry. But it does mean they have 8 cruisers and 4 ironclads, 4 battleships. We're powerful. We're powerful. Anyway, back on to the International Squadron. I've discussed the International Squadron several times in various videos, but this is the multinational force, which was of course made up of the Austro-Hungarian Navy, the French Navy, the Imperial German Navy, the Imperial Russian Navy, and the Royal Navy, that intervened in the 1897 to 1898 Greek uprising in Crete. It's always fun when you get involved in Crete. And again, this is another part of using naval power against the Ottomans, which is something that has been going on since, well, you could argue since the 1700s, but by the major powers. But of course, 1827 is the year we're all going to start thinking about, because I did discuss that recently, and the various in the battle which took place then, with Admiral Codrington in charge. Anyway, the Venezuelan crisis of 1902 to 1903. And quickly, the 1827 one is the Battle of Navarino, for those looking. There are a couple of videos about that on the channel now. The Venezuelan crisis of 1902 to 1903. Now, this is an interesting time for everyone, really. So, basically, President Cipriano Castro refused to pay his foreign debts and damages suffered by European citizens in the Venezuelan civil wars. He did this on the belief that the Monroe Doctrine would mean that Washington, America, would intervene to prevent any European military intervention. He was banking everything on the Monroe Doctrine. There are 2 small issues of this when you're banking on a power intervening on your behalf. First of all, you're hoping that power has enough power to intervene on your behalf, and 2, that they want to intervene on your behalf. The power at the time, as they were, Theodore Roosevelt, who was president, decided to take the understanding that the Monroe Doctrine meant European seizure of territory, rather than intervention as in asking for their money back per se. After all, they might need to ask for their money back at some point. It's a subtle distinction. It's a very interesting and subtle distinction. So the US was told no one's seizing territory. The Germans might have been going to seize territory, but the British went along to make sure they didn't, because the British didn't want the Germans in Venezuela. That would have just caused trouble in the Caribbean, and it would have caused trouble in other parts. It wasn't a good thing to have the Germans getting into Venezuela. And it's a good thing too, because if they had, that would have just been a whole nother phase of World War One probably would have caused the Americans to actually get involved earlier in World War One. I can imagine the Americans would have got involved in World War One a lot earlier if they'd been able to use the rallying cry of Monroe Doctrine and Venezuela, but we'll leave that to one side. The blockade turns up. The Venezuelan Navy tries to fight. It doesn't go well. It just doesn't go well. The British were very careful. They waited for the Germans to announce how many ships they were sending. And the British then sent double that. So the Germans decided to send 4 ships. Protected cruisers mostly. Always nice. The British turned up with 8. To make sure the point was made. Now, there is some interesting history in the Venezuelan crisis in that Roosevelt afterwards claimed he was far more powerful and potent and capable in it than he actually was. Because, honestly, if he'd mobilized his fleet and said he was going to invade, or going to fight back, or attack the fleets involved, well, he'd have found very quickly A, the Royal Navy would be mobilised, B, the German Navy would have been mobilised, C, the French Navy would have been mobilised, D, the Italian Navy in full would have been mobilised, and it's starting to sound quite bad for the Americans. Yes, they'd won the 1899 war versus the Spanish, but the Spanish fleet, as we discussed, was not the Royal Navy, certainly not the German Navy, and not the French and the Italian navies. And if you combine them all together with potentially the Russian Navy coming along as well for the fun of it, and the Austro-Hungarian Navy, then that's a lot of ships. That is a lot of ships. And that would not have gone well. I mean, the American Navy would have put up a good one. But the odds would not have been in their favour. Again, the American Navy is not the Spanish Navy. They would have put up a good fight. It would not have been a successful one, but it would have been a fight. The other problem for the Americans in terms of getting involved was that the Germans had actually started off by trying to get Venezuela to pursue international arbitration via the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. And the British representative sent Castro 17 notes about the British government's concerns, and he didn't reply to any of them. So he basically backed himself into a corner, believing the Monroe Doctrine would protect him. This is especially stupid when considered that when he'd been vice president, Roosevelt said, if any South American country misbehaves towards any European country, let the European country spank it. And had reiterated that view to Congress in December 1901. So you've got a guy who's literally said, I will not intervene if you're mucking around and you're not living up to your international duties to protect you. And saying you're not going to pay foreign debts, etc., and all these sort of things. Well, when you owe $15 million worth of debt, and you're not paying the odds on it, especially in 1901, that's a lot of money. You feel strong, you feel powerful saying no, and you feel you can say no because the Americans will come protect you. They won't. And even if they had, it would have caused a very interesting war, considering the Anglo-Japanese alliance, etc., and the Japanese feeling towards the Americans. I have a feeling the Anglo-Japanese relations, etc. I have a feeling you could have ended up with a very interesting war being fought, where America loses most of its territories and protectorates that it has beyond America and its fleet. And it's going to depend on what's happened to the German ships in that initial engagement as to whether or not they find themselves with various armies fighting. Because if the Americans reacted by invading Canada or something like that as well, then you'd have British ground forces deployed. The Germans would probably say, oh, we'll come along as well. In which case you have an Anglo-German army in Canada coming south. And that's just... It's one of those scenarios where you sit there and go, thank God Roosevelt was far more intelligent than Castro was in terms of working out... Well, not... Cipriano Castro. In working out what the reality was. However, afterwards, after it's all over... And, by the way, in June 1902, Castro had seized a British ship, the Queen. Never a good thing to see something called the Queen. Don't do it. Don't do it. It wasn't helped by, obviously, Edward VII and Kaiser Wilhelm getting up to some extra diplomacy on it. But honestly, the afterwards claimings of Roosevelt that that Germany's acquiescence to arbitration was from his threats to, fight German ships using Dewey's fleet, led to George Herring in 2011 responding, "No evidence has ever been discovered of a presidential ultimatum. Recent research concludes, on the contrary, that although the Germans behaved their usual heavy-handedness, in general they followed Britain's lead. The British, in turn, went out of their way to avoid undermining their relations with the United States. Both nations accepted arbitration to extricate themselves from an untenable situation and stay on good terms with the United States." There are others, though, who claim that the Secretary of State's remarks at various points were as close to a direct threat as it's possible to come in diplomatic parlance. I'm not sure, because please take this the right way, and it's kind of like... It's sometimes when you look at it and you go, the British were bending over backwards to be nice to the Americans, da-da-da-da-da. No. It's a good reading on that if you are perhaps an American historian, and if you're looking back in time with current eyes. But if you're thinking about at time with British eyes at the time they were doing everything they can to limit the Germans, because there's already a naval race going on. There's already a diplomatic tension sneaking in. The British are trying to limit the Germans' abilities to get, how do I put this politely, status and honour outside of Germany, because whenever they have it, they then want more. So the Americans become a useful excuse. Upsetting the Americans becomes a useful excuse for the British to limit the Germans' ability to move around and do things. But it's a case of playing one off against the other. And it works. It means the Germans can't say the British are reneging on their agreements and not supporting European power. And it means the British don't have to deal with an American invasion of Canada, which, frankly, would have been annoying to deal with. And, again, the Americans would have probably done a better job than they had previously. But it's now a long time from the American Civil War, and a lot of those veterans are no longer able to be called up. Which have been the reason of their success in previous battles. There's also the fact the Italians are along, and they get forgotten quite a lot, but they do turn up. This ship. The Giovanni Bausan turns up, but not just her. The Italians actually tend to have roughly 2, sometimes more vessels,
out in the region providing part of the force, and they're another thing which is acting as an extent a restraint on the Germans, and another factor in the negotiations. There is a lot more European involvement and a European power presence there than just the British and the Germans. It's not a two-way diplomacy going on, and it's certainly not a simple transactional of the British restraining the Germans because they're afraid of the Americans, because no one's really afraid of the Americans at this point. Which is a shock to probably many people to hear about if they're thinking about America as it is today. But America in 1901, 1902, 1903, they're a major power, but they're not a power which any of the really big powers are going to sweat that much. Because their funding of their navy comes in bumps. It's sometimes lumps, or sometimes it's nothing, it's sporadic. Their army is continually being undermined by their own government in terms of its sustainment of funding. The country as a whole seems to spend most of its time fighting each other and arguing with itself. It's had a civil war not that long ago. It's got huge amounts of infrastructure it's having to build, and its industry is nowhere near what it will become in the run-up to the First World War, and certainly not what it will become in the run-up to and after the Second World War. So, yeah. It's a powerful nation, but the thing is, the Italians were feeling very confident sending this vessel over there, and that if the Americans or any other power did intervene, along with the British and the German ships, they'd do well. And again, Dewey's fleet. Dewey's a good commander, and he has some very capable ships. But unless the Americans had mobilized a significantly more force, than he has in Puerto Rico at the time, they ain't gonna come and take on a force which is, well, 15 odd ships and easily win. It's not, again, this is not, you're dealing with a fleet of 15 or so ships from Britain, from Germany, from Italy. The Germans are going to send their best because they want to do well. So these are definitely not going to be the unworked up, untrained Spanish you fought in 1899. The British ships are going to be fairly well trained and fairly well organised, because whilst they do have a large fleet, they do tend to keep it in fairly good order and fairly good organisation. They have some strange ideas sometimes, but they are fairly good organised and fairly good. And again, the Italian ships sent, they are not going to send their less. This is a big international engagement. They're going to send their best, the best ship they can in terms of crew and capability they can send. So, yeah, that would not have been fun. And this ship is part of that. This ship is viewed as part of that force. The eventual agreement resulted in the Washington Protocols, and they went home. And then was a useful ship for the next few years until World War I, when she was used as a useful hull. There are some points, though, in it which are, how do I put this, interesting in terms of what's going on. And it's certainly an episode where there are many layers of diplomacy being carried out. And this is the Italian ship at the heart of it. The former flagship of the Red Sea Fleet. Well, Red Sea Squadron. Anyway, hope you enjoyed that. It's an interesting career for this ship, and it shows what these cruisers can get up to. And yeah. Next, the question for this video is sort of based on some of the reaction to the Mersey class and the second class protected cruisers, because there's been many people going, oh, these ships must have been pointless and da 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 da, and some people even comparing to modern OPVs and going, they are pointless. They're not. And even OPVs, in this period, the equivalent would be a sloop, are not pointless. They have a presence mission, turning up for doing the day-to-day flag showing, and that's valuable. They have the counter-piracy maritime security missions, again, very useful. They have the diplomatic missions when you want to send in something which is definitely not powerful enough that anyone should be getting offended by, and if anyone is getting offended by, they look like they are children. That's what they're useful for. But second-class protected cruisers, they're the level above that. They are, as said, like light frigates. So the question today is, if you are structuring modern warships, and we do, I know bilge pumps are working on the rating system, and I'm very much keeping to the rating system for my own work. But I thought it'd be kind of interesting to put this question out there, because there was one version of the system we did consider, but then decided against, and I'd like to see what people think about it. If you were going to define second class and first class, and you can even go third class if you want, frigate, first and second class destroyer, and you can even add that figure to cruisers if you want, but I don't think there are enough cruisers really to have a first and second class cruiser in the world, unless you're going to call all the Kirov's first class cruisers and everything else a second class cruiser in comparison. But yes, first, second and third class carrier, etc. What would your definitions be for them? What would their capabilities be, and what do you see them as each in that sort of class giving you the capabilities to do? What does each class give you capabilities? Because second class protected cruisers, earlier protected cruisers, they give you the ability to have presence in a way which requires less cost and outlay than an armoured cruiser does. Because once you're building an armoured cruiser, you're building an armoured cruiser, and that's going to be an expensive and powerful ship. Whereas this one, you can get away with a couple of 10-inch guns. You can get away with 6-inch guns. And it's still powerful enough, and it's got the torpedo tubes as well. That's going to make the point. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. And yeah, what have we got coming up? Battle of Cornell tomorrow. I'm going to be recording it in 5 minutes. Ooh! This is, of course, the last day of October. It's the 31st of October. Happy Halloween! Hope you all enjoy it. Oh, we've got a lot coming up. I'm looking forward to the Soviet Navy ones, because I've been working on that for most of last year. So actually writing the PowerPoints has been incredibly cathartic. You'll notice I have the long patrol, the recorded videos, because it was just, I did one version of it, and it was literally a 4-hour video recorded, and I just went, that I will save, but I will never deploy it. Because A, it sounds long and rambling, and B, it's incredibly detailed, but it's also incredibly shows the level of sort of how much reading on the Soviet Navy I've been doing at that point. You can record these videos too soon after doing all the research. I have discovered that one, because then you try to cram too much in and it becomes like a badly written paper. So I decided to divide it up into 1918 to 1939, 1939 to 65, and 1965 to 91. Hope you enjoy. But live will be 1918 to 1991. Wish me luck. And that'll be on Friday the 23rd. Not sure why I've put it on the Friday the 23rd. I know I have a reason. I think I have a Christmas party on the 22nd. Anyway, thank you very much, everyone. Take care and have fun. Thank you for all your support. Wouldn't be able to do anything, all the stuff I'm doing without it. So thank you very much. Take care.